How long has the KEF LS50 Meta been out for? I don't know, year and a half, 2 years now? Why have I not reviewed it sooner? Because nobody would send me one. So thank you to Audio Advice, audioadvice.com. There's a cheap plug for them for loaning me this speaker to review. If you are interested in supporting a company who supports what I do, please make sure you go check out audioadvice.com for all of your AV needs. They didn't pay me to say any of this stuff. They just sent me the speaker. They don't even know what I'm going to do with it. I'm just going to review it just like I did the Sonos Fiber 2, and I'm going to send it back. But I really want to thank them because without their support, there would be a lot of speakers that you all get to see that otherwise wouldn't have been able to be seen by my reviews. Gosh, that was convoluted. Anyway, audioadvice.com. Check them out. The KEF LS50 Meta is a really good speaker all around. Retails for about $1,600 typically. Currently, as of this video, which is December 19th, 2023, retails for about $1,000. And at $1,000 for the pair, I think it's a good buy. But there are some caveats. One is the bass for me in my room doesn't quite get as low as I would want it to. Another one is that there seems to be a little bit of attack, maybe some real clarity and snare and trumpets and just the zip kind of sound that I expect, the kind of dynamic sound that makes you go like that. And it's a real delicate balance with many loudspeakers where sometimes they can be too much and other times they're not enough, or maybe they're carved out just a little bit in that 1 to 2 kilohertz region. And speaking about this balance, you know, some speakers, it's a little bit too much there in that particular region. Now, in my listening, what I would have preferred, I wish I had equalization on hand to quickly make this adjustment, but I didn't. I can do it after the fact, but I haven't done it yet, would be to add about probably 2 decibels, right around 2 kilohertz, to see if doing that brings back some of that snap, some of that attack, and that definition that I feel like I was missing out on when I was listening to the speakers. I'm going to be curious to see what the data shows because I'm actually creating my subjective opinion portion of the video while the data is running. That's why you only see one speaker behind me. I thought it would be interesting to try to do it this way. So those two things aside, the speaker is really good. One thing that I really latched onto immediately with this speaker is the imaging and the focus precision. Some speakers don't image very well. And that can be a function of the soundstage radiations. Maybe it's too wide. You've got too much room involvement. And then that could also be a function of frequency response matching. So what I'm going to do with this speaker is I'm actually going to measure both of them. And I'm going to see how well the frequency response matches. I'm curious to see if they're really close to a matched pair. And maybe that might explain why the imaging was so precise with these speakers. And that'll come later. We'll see together what that looks like. The other aspect about these speakers and their imaging is that you can point them directly at you on axis, or you can tow them out away from you off axis. Generally speaking, coincident drivers like this one are best aimed about 10 to 20 degrees off axis, away from your head. Now, what I found through playing around with these speakers is that aiming them just outside of my shoulder, which is roughly 6 inches off of my shoulder, and I don't know, not everybody's shoulder width is the same, so let's just ballpark that at about 15 degrees. It's in that region. I found that doing that resulted in the best balance of sound for these speakers. In doing so, there was no loss of anything per se. The imaging was still tight and focused, which doesn't always happen. What I've grown to expect is that when I take speakers and I change the aiming position of them, tow them in or out one way or the other, the imaging could tighten up or it could become more diffuse. Towing out usually will make a speaker's imaging become a little bit more diffuse. That didn't happen with these speakers. I'm going to be curious to see if there's something in the data that might give me a hint as to why. The other factor is that I played around with positioning off the wall. Now, off the wall from the back of the speaker to the wall, I initially started off at about 2 feet. The bass just wasn't quite there for me. And then the lower vocal wasn't quite there, around the 100, 200 hertz region, just that lower fundamental vocal of male and female voices. 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 So when I pushed the speaker about 10 inches off the wall, that really seemed to kind of be the sweet spot where it gave me a little bit more bass oomph. It gave me that 100 to 200 hertz, not resonant sound, but a little bit more chestiness in the lower vocal, which also gave me a little bit more mid-bass impact. Now, I understand, and I hope that you understand, that predominantly the room is responsible for bass. Up to about 400, 500, 600 hertz, up until about the middle of the mid-range, the room is really going to have a drastic effect on what you hear. Above that point, above that transition frequency, or the Schroeder frequency, if you want to Google that, SCHOR, good Lord, SCHROEDER. Listen, I'm not an English major. Google it, check it out. But above that frequency, what happens is the speaker is more dominant and more causal of the sound that you're going to hear. And when pushing the speaker back a little bit closer to the wall behind it, that made a positive improvement in my case. In your case, it may not work out the same way. There's a lot of things going on. It's not just the position of the speaker, it's the position of the speaker relative to you. So if you move back another foot, that'll change things. But I wanted to say that because there were some aspects that could be improved upon by simply taking the time to position the speaker appropriately. I'll go back to talking about the aiming of the speaker. When I tweaked the speaker out about 30 degrees, the soundstage seemed to get a little bit wider, but if I'm being honest, it didn't seem like it got as wide as maybe I would have expected. So I don't know that in this particular case that maybe you're going to expect to improve the soundstage width by towing them out away from you, but it might improve slightly. In my case, I still landed on about 15 degrees or so, as I said, about 6 inches off of my shoulders. And that worked out to be the best aiming between imaging, tonality, and soundstage. And going back to soundstage, the thing that I generally really like about KEFs is that many standard speakers will have what I would consider a rectangular shaped soundstage. You can basically draw a box around the soundstage or around the speakers to illustrate the soundstage. And that's cool and all, you know, I mean, maybe it gets wider than the speakers themselves, maybe it gets deeper, but there's almost a hard boundary to that soundstage. Whereas with most of the KEF speakers that I've listened to, the one thing that I typically notice is that the soundstage isn't rectangular, it's more like an oval shape. And at the edges, it's a little bit harder to define. Now, that may be something that you think is cool, or maybe you don't like it. Personally, I like the ambiguity of, that's a fun word, ambiguity of not knowing exactly where the edge of the soundstage is. Because to me, if I can say, all right, well, the singer is outside the soundstage or outside the speaker, but he's right there and that's the drop off. There's nothing else out there. That's not as fun an effect as saying, well, the singer, you know, is on the bleeding edge of that soundstage, but it's a little bit hard to tell if he makes the definition for that or not. Now, on the recording itself is really going to dictate how that should be. And the rest of it is all an illusion, truthfully. The stereo effect is all an illusion. But when it comes to preference, I really like how KEF creates the 3D soundstage as more of an oval shape instead of a hardly defined rectangular boundary. With those things said, at $1,000 per pair, I honestly think this is kind of a no-brainer speaker. If you're looking for something that fits a relatively small foot space, but I do definitely recommend you get a subwoofer unless you plan on listening really close to the speaker, because by my estimation, around 50 hertz or so, the speaker starts to roll off pretty quickly in room. Now let's take a look at the data and see what we get. Before we get into that, let's talk about the specifics of this speaker. This speaker features a Uni-Q drive unit, which is KEF's terminology for their concentric drive unit. It's a 5 1/4 inch aluminum cone woofer and a 1 inch vented aluminum dome tweeter. The spec frequency response is 79 hertz to well above 20 kilohertz. 79 hertz is interesting. I hadn't checked this before I talked about the limit on the low end. So it's going to be interesting to see if the speaker can do 50 hertz in a room based on the data. Sensitivity is spec'd at 85 decibels, and I will say that I'm using a Macintosh MC462 to drive this speaker. Normally, I'm at about the -3 dB point on my Pre-Pro. In this particular case, I was about +2 to +3 dB for some tracks. So by that totally anecdotal analysis, I will say that more than likely, you're probably going to need a little bit extra power if you're used to speakers that have higher sensitivity, but we'll see what the data shows for that as well. All of my data is captured using the Clipple near-field scanner. I'm sure you know by now, but I'm still going to tell you. It is a state-of-the-art device that allows you to get anechoic data in a non-anechoic room, such as my garage, which you see in this short clip. Now, the reason that's important is because we want to separate out what the speaker is doing from any interactions with the room. And that way it allows us to have a better understanding of why we hear what we hear. First up is the impedance. Minimum is about 3.7 ohm above 80 hertz. And on average, I would say that the mid-range itself dips down to around 4 ohm. This is the direct on-axis response. You can see that the mean SPL is calculated at 83 decibels. Again, probably a little bit more powerful amp than most other speakers that you're going to typically buy. F3 is at 67 hertz. F10 is at 42 hertz. That goes along with what I was saying earlier about it didn't sound like these speakers got much below 50 hertz in room. And that kind of makes sense. But it's also worth noting that this speaker has a little bit of an extended shelf response. Whereas instead of falling off with this curvature right through here and continuing on down through here, there's a little bit of a tweak to the ported response that allows it to extend just a little bit further. That's typically best suited for boundary reinforcement, so maybe placing a little bit closer to a wall than you normally might do for a typical hi-fi setup. Now, we're all taught that you should put speakers out at least 3 feet into the room, but for most people, that's not really practical. And with the size of the speaker, it kind of makes sense that KEF, being the designers and the smart engineers that they are probably also expecting that people who are buying smaller speakers like this may not have the luxury of bringing the speakers all the way out into the room. Even if you are somebody who's hosting parties, you probably don't want people tripping over your speakers in your large living room. So you'll probably want to put them a little bit closer to the wall. And that actually goes along with what I found to work the best. When I push the speakers up a little bit closer to the wall, I got a better overall response. Now, sometimes that can be a little bit too boomy when you put a speaker close to the wall. But the way that they've designed this extended bass shelf is that it allows the speaker to play a little bit lower without sounding overly boomy. Still, though, you're going to want a subwoofer if you want really solid chest thump below about 50 hertz. If I turn the speaker off axis slightly, there's not a whole lot of change except for the higher frequency area tends to smooth out. I'm going to go back to 0 degrees. And here we go. We can see that there's a strong diffraction dip around maybe 8 kilohertz or so. 15 degrees again. And that's kind of smoothed out. And that goes along with saying that concentric designs generally fare better when you tow them slightly out off axis. This is the CEA 2034 data set at 0 degrees. Same thing that we saw earlier. And I want to pay attention to the early reflections and the sound power. Both of these look good, but they also show a mild scoop through this 2 to 3 kilohertz region that jives with what I heard in my listening. Early reflections directivity index looks good. And this indicates, because it's linear, somewhat linear, not a flat line, but a line slope, that if you have equalization, you can use it and apply it pretty well to this particular speaker. And that means that when you apply it, not only does it affect the direct sound, but it affects the off-axis sound as well. But because the off-axis sound is very similar to the direct sound, then you get the benefit of equalization, allowing you to make certain changes for the better or just plain old for your own leisure if you want. Now turning the speaker 15 degrees off axis, what happens? Again, same thing we saw earlier. Nothing really changes with the early reflections directivity index. It's mainly just the smoothness of the upper frequency response. Looking at the estimated in-room response, 0 degrees, 15 degrees, and 30 degrees, black, blue, red, respectively. This jives with what I mentioned earlier about how positioning the speaker toe in, toe out, things like that, didn't really have an impact on the imaging precision as much as I would have expected. If we go to the next slide, this kind of shows a general trend line of what I heard in room. Low frequency roll off of around 50 hertz. Again, it's going to vary from room to room, but the estimation kind of gives us a hint of what we can expect. The main thing that I want to point out, though, is this high frequency. So this dip of about 2 to 3 decibels between 2 to 4 kilohertz or so in this ballpark. This is what I noticed in my listening, where things just sounded kind of maybe thin, didn't quite have the attack that I wanted. And I wanted to point that out here so you can kind of see where it is in the data. Horizontal directivity, about plus or minus 50 at the negative 6 dB point, which jives with what I heard. Vertical directivity is roughly the same. It's just a little bit different, but it's roughly the same, which really means that the sound that's emitted from the speaker is going to sound very similar no matter where you are, within reason. Let's say within about plus or minus 50 degrees above, below, to the side of the speaker. As long as you're within that like 50 degree cone, if you will, or plus or minus 50 degrees, so it's a 100-degree cone, then you should have pretty much the same overall tonality from the speaker. Distortion at 86 decibels at 1 meter and at 96 decibels at 1 meter. What I see here is distortion that's pretty high on the lower frequency end, but it should come as a no-brainer that, you know, you're running a single 5¼ inch mid-woofer with tweeter housing that takes up a pretty significant portion of the surface area. So that cone isn't going to have a lot of sound pressure. It's not going to push the sound molecules in the air the same way a standard 5¼ inch mid-woofer will. And so we're going to have a little bit higher distortion ratings on that alone. Now, if we look at multi-tone distortion, we can see that at the highest output level, which is equal to about 96 decibels at 1 meter, anechoic, one speaker, we go over this 3% distortion threshold. And I will say that when I was really playing these speakers loud at about 100 decibels, which, guys, you really don't need to be listening to them that loud. I do that so I can push them and I can relate some of this data back to you. When I was pushing the speaker that loud, I certainly heard distortion. It was an unpleasant sound. This data kind of indicates, yeah, at the highest output levels, you can expect some distortion. So I would say based on this step right here is about 88 decibels. I would say going above 96 decibels, you're probably in that no-fly zone. But what happens if you use a subwoofer? Well, not a lot. As you can see here, we still have the higher distortion in this 1 to 2 kilohertz area. And then above about 5 kilohertz, we still have higher distortion. So if we use a subwoofer crossed over at 80 hertz, it wouldn't really change the higher frequency and the mid-range distortion for this particular speaker. But it would change the lower mid-range down here and then going to right here. That is reduced. What about compression? How loud can the speaker play? What does its response do as you increase it from 76 decibels to 102 decibels in these steps? 76, 86, 96, 102. Well, at 102 compared to 76, there's a deviation of about 3 decibels at around 80 hertz. And we've got some other deviations going on here. All in all, what I will say is that based on this data, the 96 decibels at 1 meter anechoic for one speaker would probably be the better pointer toward where you can listen to the speaker, how loud you can listen to it. So if you need to hit about 93 decibels at 4 meters, you can do that. If you need to go above 93 decibels at 4 meters, you might run into some issues. You might hear the woofer overexerting itself, maybe increased distortion, things of that nature. And finally, we have this graphic. This is showing me the delta of the frequency response between the two different speakers that I have. I measured one, I took it off the stand, I put the other one on the stand, and I tried to align it as perfectly as I could. But keep in mind that, you know, if I turn it slightly off axis because I only have one laser guide, with all of that in mind, we can see that there's a deviation of about half a decibel between the two speakers. I would consider that good. I have seen other deviations from other speakers that I've measured way in the past that had deviations of 2 to 3 decibels at different frequencies. And I would say that that probably gives some, what's the word I'm looking for here? I guess evidence for my thinking that the reason that I was hearing imaging precision being so good is because of the speaker matching between left to right. That does it for this review. If you've watched it this far, I do appreciate it. To kind of summarize things, overall, this is a really good speaker. It does sit on the laid back side of neutral. And when I say neutral, what I mean is a speaker that doesn't really alter the sound too much. In this particular case, there is that little bit of a dip somewhere around 2 to 3 kilohertz that resulted in me hearing a lack of attack, maybe clarity, maybe speech intelligibility if you're using these speakers for television. Now, it's not a lot, but it was enough, at least for me, to feel like it was missing. And I would personally go back in and add about 2 decibels or so right in that particular reason to get back that sound that I'm looking for. That aside, that's really my only complaint as far as tonality goes. You're going to want to use a subwoofer for these, and I think that probably goes without saying. Yeah. So again, I want to thank you for watching the video. If you haven't already, please consider joining me at patreon.com. That's a good way to support me, or you can use my audio advice affiliate link if you want to buy these speakers while they're currently on sale. That would help me out, but also show them that you're paying attention and you appreciate what they're doing by going through them. I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.